going to turn this over to Susan, and then I'll say, if you have any questions, if you'll hold them till the end. Does that sound good to you, Susan?
Sure.
So perfect. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure to be speaking to a great group of women, always my favorite audience. So I'm just going to put my bias out there right out front, because it's just my experience that women go and take this information and they start using it right away. And that's my greatest joy. My greatest dream is that people take the tools that they're given and put them to work right away. And frankly, I structure all of my talks to be used that way. So I'm hoping that this will give you some inspiration and some thoughtful contemplation as well about the power of storytelling. And so with that, if you wouldn't mind, Diane, if you could give me the opportunity to share the screen, that would be great. And I'll happily throw up my PowerPoint and we can dive right in together. So I want to start off by telling you a little bit about storytelling as a method of communications. And as I first got into this business of storytelling, I realized that this is a technique that is not effectively used in our day-to-day lives in a way that we think about it as a strategic tool. So I had the good fortune to go and work with Corning Glass, one of the biggest glass manufacturers in the world. And I was helping a team of fractographers. Now, I didn't know what a fractographer was when I got there, but a fractographer is someone who studies how things break. I think they could have employed my 6-year-old at the time. Would have been very helpful to know that he had a PhD professional track waiting for him. But they were about to pitch a very big new innovation to the CEO and the board, looking for a lot of funding. And I said, well, why don't you show me the presentation? And so this was the first slide. This is a molecular model of sand, of silica, of glass, right? This is the bare bones model of what glass looks like. And they had developed this incredible breakthrough. It just looked like this at the proton, neutron, and electron level. And they were explaining to me how fabulous this level of breakthrough was, when in the middle of the conversation, Amy, one of the fractographers, got a text from her sister that she had just become an aunt because Amy's sister had a baby. And so we were passing around the cell phone, ooh-eyeing over the baby. And then everything settled down and we went back to talking about this fantastic model. And my eyes rolled to the back of my head and I thought, I am so bored. There are 62 more slides that look just like this one. I said, Amy, can you show us the picture of the baby one more time? And I looked at it and I go, wow, take a look at that. Imagine all those capillaries that are forming right now inside that baby's body, and the neurons that are just firing inside of her brain. And can you think about just how hard that little gallbladder is working right now? And they all just kind of looked at each other. And I said, we don't care about your diagram. We don't care about your protons, neutrons, and electrons. Like Amy's sister's baby, we want to know the impact that this baby has on us when we see her picture right now, and the impact that this little baby is going to have on the world and her family and everyone who comes into contact with her over the course of her life. We want to know how Amy's baby's life is going to make ours change. And so with that, we started to re-examine that entire 62-page PowerPoint presentation and wound up converting it into something far more exciting, which I'll be telling you about a little bit later. So I wasn't always an innovation storyteller. As Diane was telling you, I was a former epidemiologist at the CDC, looking at all the variant strains of HIV coming into the United States back in 1998. At that point, we had gone through A through Z, and we are now at double H in terms of the number of variants of the HIV virus back in the day. Prior to that, I was a bit of a revolutionary. I studied in Central America as an anthropologist and decided I wanted to change the world back in those days. And I put on my revolutionary hat and made it to the front lines of the war in Nicaragua, thinking that I would join la lucha, join the fight there. But my way up to that front line, I got to see the destruction that war causes and decided that that was not going to be how I was going to change the world. I wound up hitchhiking through 5 more countries and discovering a culture and a planet that was very different than what I had known back home in New York, and decided I would make a change really in healthcare. And so I continued my studies and wound up studying AIDS, prostitution, and tourism in Thailand specifically, and wanted to work with Indigenous and Thai cultures to figure out how to stop the spread of HIV there. And at the time, 1 in 6 sexually active people where I lived in northern Thailand were HIV positive already. So that was 1994. Oops, excuse me. And the desire to change how we understood the virus, to understand how people were being impacted by the virus, was dramatic. At the time, the discussion around HIV and AIDS was largely focused around prevention, right? As it should be, get HIV and die. That was the message of the Minister of Public Health. And they invented all these terrifying posters and so forth that would tell you about all the different ways that you could die in the event that you got HIV. It was frightening. And I will tell you one thing, a shock and awe campaign of that level of terror was highly effective for about 6 months. And then it wasn't. We saw rapidly rising rates of HIV in that community. And so when you're a marketer and you find something that works, when you find something that actually makes rates plummet, you do what? You double down on that strategy. And so that's what we did. We found scarier posters and symptoms and terrifying case studies of people who were dying slow, horrible deaths. That is what the Ministry of Public Health had us do. And again, it worked for a while until it didn't. And I'll remind you, the only innovation we had at the time was the condom. Does anyone want to come off mute and take a guess of how old the condom is? How ancient the condom is? What would you guess if you had to just throw out a number? When do you think first archaeological evidence of the condom came into being? Who wants to take a guess? Be brave, ladies. Meg, what do you think?
I don't know. I was going to say 80 years.
80 years, good guess.
Yeah,
Anyone else? I feel like this is the Price is Right showdown here. What's your next guess? What would you guess?
I'll say 100 years.
100 years, fantastic. Sure, sheep stomachs and those things, right? That's what we hear about ancient. What if I were to tell you that the first archaeological evidence of the condom was 10,000 years ago, painted on the caves of France in the Grotte du Carombel? We do not know whether or not this graffiti, this painting, is a public health message or someone talking about having a great night the night before. But either way, 10,000 years. And at that time, as we're talking about innovation, that was the only tool that I had at my disposal to fight HIV. And it was unfortunate because there were no vaccines, there were no over-the-counter medicines back in 1994 in rural Thailand. And so the condom and a clean syringe were my only tools at my disposal. But I did realize that if we were going to change anything about how that process was working, we were going to have to change it at the personal level. So I worked in brothels with sex workers and their customers, telling a story that we realized the story needed to change. And what was fundamentally at the center of that story was making the listener the hero and allowing every sex worker, every customer, and even the mamasans, the owners of those brothels, was to turn those individuals into heroes. So if you stop for a moment and think about it, what is the story what is the motivation behind the mama-san in running a brothel? What is her greatest motivator? What would you guess? Profit? Most likely. And for the customer who was coming into a brothel, what was he typically looking for?
A good time.
A good time, absolutely. And what do you think the sex worker was looking to get out of her engagement there?
Income.
Income for her families, right?
Yeah.
Most of the women that I worked with sent money home, and they had a typical time period of around 2 years working in a brothel, and then would go back to their lives completely integrated, no stigma associated with that previous work. They would get married and have kids. The only problem with that supply chain, I would say, engagement is that people were actively bringing HIV home and spreading it. And so what those women were typically looking for, aside from the money, was survival. The average woman I was working with saw about 8 customers a night. So I don't know about any of you, but the thought of having sex 8 times in a night, then having to do that with a condom, then having to do that with people you're not even really that excited about, is a pretty perilous undertaking. So we had to shift. I realized the only tool I had at my disposal was the story. And so we shifted that conversation for those women and those men to allowing them to see themselves in a different light. And that
Just a
shift
little, please.
was oriented around, number one, for the mama-san, as perhaps being able to tell a story of being the cleanest brothel in town, the most responsible brothel in town, where they know that you could come back for a repeat visit and weren't going to get sick as a result. For the participant, let's say, or the customer, is how could we turn that individual into a hero himself, meaning that he would come home as the protector of his family rather than the infector of his family. And finally, for the sex worker, what we wanted to do is create an opportunity for her to become the hero of her own story, the master of her own destiny, rather than just surviving it. And so we did a lot of ethnographic work, a lot of anthropological work to ask the question, what would it mean if you could be the owner of your own destiny? And what we found was those women actually wanted to become entrepreneurs. They wanted to start their own small businesses and see a future for themselves 2 years later. And envisioning that future would change everything. The story itself became the innovation. And so when I was thinking about how can I really help them to tell their stories and to think about their own stories, I was an anthropology and a religion major in college. And I always was fascinated with how the prophets were able to move the word around the world. And how are they able to do that without Twitter? I mean, it's just miraculous when you think about it, really, right? 12 close friends head off on a journey. They want to absolutely change the world. And they've got 12 guys, right, to do it. You know, so I was fascinated as a communications person by the Buddha, Muhammad, Jesus, Moses. How do you move the word? And I think about the greatest viral storytellers of all time. These are people who got other people to tell their story for them. They got other people to tell their story for them long after they were dead, long after their time, their politics, their context had changed. How did we do it that we were still able to tell these stories so many years after? And so I started to examine exactly the stories that they told, how they structured them, and how they spoke them. And so I want to share with you the result of that analysis. And it looks like this: the 5 essential rules of innovation storytelling. When you're actually trying to affect change, what are the structures of a story that work using the same models that the prophets did? So step 1, and this goes for all of us. You might ask yourself, why is she talking to me about brothels and religion? I like talking about sex, politics, and religion right up front in all my presentations. It galvanizes people in one way or another, and people are certainly awake. But this comes back down to how all great orators speak when they're trying to tell a story to affect change. And the first is a shared history. So when you're telling a story, when you want to get people to change their behavior, you have to start off with a shared history. So all of the prophets turn to their faith of origin. Right? I'll say that because we have changed how they viewed their faith over time as well. But it starts with a shared history, our calendar of events, those things that we share in common, whether it's festivals, holidays, mourning events, right? Challenging events in our history. And even if when we come to the workplace, when we think about that shared history, we ask ourselves questions like, why did we decide to come to work here? What is it about the reputation, the brand, and the history of this company that we delight in? What was our first day of work like? What is it like to work here? What is the shared history, good and bad, that we come to together? So whenever you're about to tell a story, think about your listener and ask, where's that shared experience? Step one. Step two, if you're looking to enact change and influence people, is values. So what are the values that we take from that shared history and we bring them into this new state of being? What are those values? So whether it's innovation, transparency, kindness, connection, whatever those core values are, speed, driven, growth at all costs. I don't have a value judgment about your values. We just need to know what they are. What are those things that come from our history that we're taking with us into this new place, this new realm that we want to bring a listener to? And the next is, what is our purpose? What are we moving toward? So that shared values and purpose means that we galvanize people around the why. When you think back to those values, you look at that, maybe that original value was an eye for an eye. But as we step into a new purpose and a new way of looking at the world, that message, perhaps the hardest part of this process to write, is what's shifting in the purpose. So we go from an eye for an eye to turn the other cheek. That's a big step. That's a shift in how we view the world. And that message is so important to convey the shift. So as we think about contemplating the message, where we really want to drive people toward, think about, what is our new purpose? Where have we been before that we can all agree on? And what's the change? Because this is the place where we burn the boats, where we refuse to go back to the status quo, the way things were done in the past. But we bring with it our history and our values. And we also include now new values. What will it take to accomplish that purpose? So if it's compassion and forgiveness and loving our neighbor, those are new values, perhaps, that need to be articulated in a way that they haven't been before. That says we cannot go back to doing things the way they were. Now, the other part of innovation storytelling is to determine who are the early adopters, those 12 apostles, that group that followed the Buddha into the forest to start the original Sangha, right? So those early adopters are those people who say, I get it, I believe it, I'm willing to follow it. Now, it might seem like these are the biggest cheerleaders in the organization, but actually, the radical adopters are oftentimes started off as the biggest skeptics. And those skeptics, when they have a change of heart, a conversion to a new way of doing things, are some of the most loyal and vocal advocates. They may not start off that way, but they're an incredible group of people. And the reason why you need early adopters when you're trying to create change is because their message, when they take your message, internalize it, and make it their own, is exponentially more powerful than your message by itself. And we'll get into a little bit about why user-generated content is so much more powerful than corporate-generated content. But the ability to take a message in, to feel it and internalize it, and then say it anew in your own words is the indication that the message is working, that the change and the shift are really taking hold. And then lastly, viral language is figuring out exactly how you're going to say it, because it needs to be memorable and it needs to have momentum, right? We need a message that moves. What's viral, as we saw from the last 2 years, is things we need super spreader events, and we need super spreader language that helps us push the message forward. So that's rhetoric, that's alliteration, that's poetry, that's short sound bites, not 3-page memos that nobody's going to read. So thinking about that viral language is also really important. And if you'd like a copy of this, I'm happy to send it to you. You can just text me and I'll gladly send you a little composite of these 5 essential rules of storytelling, so you can keep it by your desk every time you need to tell your next story. So yeah, you can just send it iStory to 66866 and I will get it off to you. So just one note around why storytelling is so powerful, because it really is. It's how our brains are hardwired to receive information. Unfortunately, 3 bullets and an Excel spreadsheet do not a story make, and it is not the way the human brain is designed to receive, retain, or more importantly, share information. That's really hard. And so stories are the way that our grandfathers communicated our own family history to us, how our moms passed on great recipes, how we got childcare information, and even just to figure out what were the geopolitics going on in the tribe next to us, right? It's stories. And that's why they stay with us forever, as the prophets would indicate, because it's simply not 3 bullets and move on. So we are ready to receive story, and your colleagues and coworkers and the audiences that you want to influence are also ready to receive a story. In fact, the human brain is hardwired such that when I share an experience with you of something that's happened to me, did you know that your brain is actively looking through its own filing cabinet, trying to find a similar story that parallels the one I'm telling you right now? Right now, as I'm talking, it's looking for that. I think I've heard that before. That sounds about right. That resonates with me. So our brain is already actively engaged in doing this just while I'm speaking. It's much harder to do that with just 3 bullets. So Stanford has already done the research for us. We also know that stories are 22 times more memorable than just facts alone. They set up an experiment with people who went into a room and heard 6 facts and asked them to memorize those 6 facts. The next group was asked to memorize those 6 facts, but they were coupled in a story. And as a result, these participants were 22 times more likely to remember all of those items when wrapped in a story. It's just how it functions. And unfortunately, what happened was around 7 minutes after leaving the room, people had forgotten those 6 objects anyway they had to memorize. So what is the point, as busy executives that we are, of sitting down to a 1-hour meeting, giving people the 3 bullets and the Excel spreadsheet, only to find out that 7 minutes later, they've forgotten everything that you told them? The other reason I love storytelling is because it is a memory-making device, and therefore it is every executive's greatest productivity tool. Because when you can leave a meeting and people actually remember what you talked about, your message is so much more powerful. And frankly, it contains that most important ingredient. It allows other people to share the message for you. That's where the great productivity comes in. So we know that there are certain structures that allow people to remember information more easily, and Pixar made an entire movie out of this, understanding, which is that emotion is the key to getting people to internalize, remember, and share a story. Why? Neurotransmitters and neurochemicals are being produced when you evoke emotion. So you're actually creating a chemical reaction in the brain that allows you to hold on to the story. This is how we physically embody a story. So when you watch a horror movie and your palms start sweating, that rush of adrenaline and cortisol, the stress hormone, is physically taking place in the body. You feel like you are part of the story. Your body has a reaction, and you hold the story now in your physical form. It's not just words anymore. It's not just images. It's at your cellular level, right? As that neurotransmitter is taking you. I unfortunately had the experience of being, just the super stepmom that I was when my kids were small. I was a stepmom to 2 kids. I am a stepmom to 2 kids, as my husband was a widower, and they had lost their mom at a very young age. And I decided to host movie night and show them Bambi. Who knows what happens in the first 7 minutes of Bambi? Yeah, so I walked in with a tray of brownies and milk just at that moment when Bambi's mom gets shot, and watched the horrified look on those 2 kids' little faces as they recognized the most horrific moment. And frankly, almost every Disney movie, every Disney main character is an orphan or child of a single parent. And you go, bastard. That moment stuck with my kids for the rest of their life, as if they hadn't had enough of that trauma, right? But that experience of emotion goes right into the core of their body, connects with an experience they had already had, and their little hearts were bumping and thumping until Bambi meets Thumper, until the next phase of the story, when we can finally exhale and breathe and say, Bambi isn't alone in the woods. Bambi now has forest friends. Bambi can now go on and lead a life, right? Even after great trauma. But these are the opportunities, and frankly, these are the tools that all great storytellers in Hollywood use, is figuring out which neurochemicals we're going to enact while telling a story. Is it disgust, fear, joy, sadness, anger? What is it exactly when we tell a story, the emotions that we wish to evoke in the audience? Do we want to make them feel like this fantastic hero? Do we want to scare them, like my experience in working in HIV at first? Do we want to shift the conversation and make the listener feel like a hero? When we did that hero shifting, we wound up dramatically dropping the rate of HIV infection. When women could see a light at the end of the tunnel to their plight as sex workers, they could see a different ending. And that's what great storytellers do as they take people on a shift through their innovation journey, through their change journey, and really their own transformation. So each time you think about telling a story, think about, what are the emotions I want to invoke? How do I want my audience to feel? And what is the language I'll use to evoke those feelings? When I first got started in working in tech back in 1999, at the beginning of the dot-com boom, everyone was trying to be a revolutionary. Every product, every service was going to revolutionize an industry for sure. It was going to be different this time, right? We were starting a revolution. And the other part that came with that revolutionary story, as marketers, we would tell the market that unless you buy this new cool fangled product from this dot-com company, you'll probably be out of business. We would say to the Fortune 500, if you don't get on board and acquire this cool new dot-com startup, you'll probably be off the Fortune 500 in not too long. And I know when I was pitching journalists, I would say, you have to speak with this revolutionary startup. They're changing the way this industry does X. And if not, I'll take this story over to the Wall Street Journal and you'll wind up looking like a laughingstock, Mr. New York Times reporter. You'll have missed out on the greatest revolution in this industry's history. So fear and revolution were the emotions that we played on at the beginning of the dot-com boom. But in 2022, in the midst of the sharing economy, that fear-driven approach doesn't work anymore. It's not successful over the long term, just like that shock and awe campaign in Thailand didn't work either over time. The sharing economy asks us to place at the center of those values goodwill. And what do I mean by goodwill? Goodwill is the art and the act of making someone's life better. Goodwill is the act of making someone else's life better, your product, your service, your ideas. So when we start at the essence with goodwill, everything shifts. We know that the brain lights up to a goodwill story. And what does a goodwill story look like? It is giving people insights about what they can and can't do, or shouldn't do based on our own experience. We give them a guide to make something better happen than what's happening today. We're painting a picture of the future that is better than what we have right now. And when we do that, I mean, think about like a very ancient Yelp review. That this last one, greater caregiving related activity, is kind of like, eat this mushroom, don't eat this mushroom. You might eat that mushroom, but something else might happen. Greater caregiving related activity is about saying to another person, I care about you and I want what's best for you. And that's why reviews have become really so central to the Amazon marketplace, to how we go out to dinner, to how we buy anything these days, is because users are talking to one another about what they love and what they hate. And that caregiving, that goodwill, is part of the essence of our sharing economy right now. So when you tell a story, we also want to think about, how are we caregiving? How are we making someone's life better when we ask them to make a bold change, to switch from the old way of doing things to the new? The other reason why this kind of advice giving, let's say, when we share with them what was and what will be, and to have other people take that story and make it their own, we know that when a listener hears it and shares it, that it's more influential on purchases, it's more memorable, and it's more trusted. So it's imperative that even as a corporate communicator, I need other people to get on board and share the story if I actually want it to be its most effective, best. Other people have to share it in order for it to work, because frankly, we don't trust big, insert name here, big nonprofit, big government, big corporate, big education. We don't trust it anymore. We need lots of other people, especially with the advent of social media, to tell us what we can, what we believe and what we don't, frankly. And by the way, it's also the way disinformation spreads so quickly, is because other people are saying it, not just, my alma mater, the CDC. It's other people saying how powerful it is. So it's the other reason why it's so hard to combat disinformation. So how do we tell an influential story where we really want to change people's mindsets and their views? So here's the formula. Is step one, always think about, before you ever begin to tell a story, how will you make your listener the hero? I'm asking you, when you're done telling the story, what do you want the outcome to be? How will you make your listener in a better position than where they are right now? If you're introducing a shift, a change, an innovation, how will their life be better on the other side of it, even if it's hard to get there? Even if they have 2 years of slogging it out in a brothel before they get to the life that they want. How will you make them the hero of the story? And they don't have to be the main character. We just want to make sure that the change that we're eliciting puts our listener in a better position than when the story started. That shared history is really important. So ask yourself, what are 2 or 3 things that you have in common, both good and bad? That you come from this shared place. Wow, it's been really rough. And we're all coming out of the coronavirus, right, in this experience right now. So what is the shared history we've had even in the recent past? What is that thing? What is it like being in a work from home situation, or frankly, going to the office or going to work and needing to be at work every day during this time? What are the things that we love about our company or our organization and the things we don't? Think of 2 or 3 points that you and your listener have in common that you can bond over. The next piece is a little bit harder. When you're trying to invoke change and influence others, you want to call out a shift. What's taking place in the world right now where everything is changing? If you can own this shift, if you can talk about how things have changed, how things are never going to be the same again, or there's a unique context that's presenting itself right now. If I was working in the autonomous vehicle space, right, I might be saying, wow, there's a shift right now happening where people have gotten to an acceptable rate of electric cars. They have gotten to an acceptable level of automation and AI in other parts of their life. People are finally ready now to take their foot off the gas pedal and let the car do it itself. There's a shift happening, but I need to know the context. I need to know the time and place of what's happening where we can call it out and our listener is engaged and says, yes, I can see that shift. Right? So that took place for our prophets in a very specific point in time. It takes place for us as the prophets who are telling the story. We have to identify the shift. Why now? Why is this important? What will happen next? If I look at a company like Zuora that went public last year and had a fantastic IPO, they explain this in terms of software, right? This is their software. And they say there's a shift going on. We are living in a very different era. In the 1970s, we sold products and that was quite transactional. Here's the product, you buy it, go take care of it, service it on your own. In the 90s, there was a layer of software sales that now had consulting associated with it. The software was really sophisticated, but it was kind of wonky. It didn't have a nice user interface, and you needed someone else to tell you how to customize it specifically for your company or your business or your IT infrastructure. In the 2000s, things became a whole lot more DIY because people started to experience what user interface and customer experience actually mattered. Thank you, Apple. And we got to do this on our own as customers. We got to experience software in a way that we hadn't before. We were in charge. And then finally, we're now in this kind of Netflix mode where we are living in a subscription model, where we pay an amount every month. We have an expectation that our software will be upgraded and updated, that we will be in a long-term relationship with a vendor, and that we have an expectation of customer service that perhaps we never had before. And we will continue to stomach rate increase after rate increase because we can't live without it. So that piece that I'll just go back here and say, this is what Zora calls, we are living in the relationship economy. That's the shift. We are living in a subscription era, right? Well, that we are now creating a message around what has shifted. We will never go back to just buying a product and walking away from something that we care about that needs constant improvement. And there are so many things we look at as a service today that we never could have imagined before. So once we have this message and it's really clear, we are living in the subscription era. Think where you are right now in your own business or your organization. What era are you living in? What was it like 10 years ago? Could you map out what's shifted and what's changed? And this is hard to believe, a 50-year timeline. I was born in 1970. I still think this is just 30 years ago, but think about it for yourself. What's changed over the last 10, 15, 20 years? Can we map it out and create a message for it? Because we are not going back. The next thing when we're communicating this message is to show them heaven. The result of showing them that 50 years of progress and change is to say to a customer or a constituent or a listener, we are so close to getting to this next phase. We are so close to getting to heaven, of getting it right, of making it better. We are this close. Look at how much effort and investment you've employed so far. Look at how you've upskilled your employees, your teammates. We're so close. You want to paint a picture of what the future will look like if they decide to follow you. And do you have that picture clear for yourself? If you know what the change would look like if they would just do X, could you paint a picture of what it would look like? And now that next step seems so close. Seems so close. It makes it easy for them to take. So if you're selling innovation, the idea is to make it easier for them. Your job with the previous slide is to lay the breadcrumbs so that they're just one step away from getting to the future that you're predicting for them. And frankly, that they want. Then and only then do you bring the magic tools, as I like to say. Do you tell them about your product or service, the legislation you want, or the change or the policy that you're looking for? Bring the magic tools. Now you'll notice I'm on slide 5, I believe, before I've ever mentioned a product or service. Or frankly, an effort that I'm asking someone to make, right? If I was thinking about the women in that brothel, only now would I begin talking about condoms, that this is the way to get there. A 10,000-year-old piece of latex. Right? So now is the time to your features, your benefits, everything that you want to tell someone about a product, a policy, a shift. And then don't talk about how phenomenal it is. Let other people say how great it is. So who are the early adopters, the allies, the customers who have already used your product and service, who are in love with it? It's the third-party validation that you need to say how great it is. And that's the other reason why these early adopters are here for you, is to say how great your ideas, your products, your service, your policies are. Get them to say how phenomenal it is, what's changed for them. And in this case, we're looking for quotes and testimonials that speak to a transformation. I'm talking about the Oprah Winfrey makeover, the before and after. We're not just as excited about what her hairstyle looks like or makeup or what her new clothes look like, but rather, what is the possibility that's there for her now that was never there before? Maybe she'll go back to college. Maybe she'll start a new job. Maybe she'll finally quit that job. Maybe she'll write that novel. Maybe she'll just have more time with her kids. But what feels like happens here is an expanse of possibility. And that's really exciting when other people say, I've done it, you can do it too. My life is transformed. And that's really the promise of innovation. It's not incremental, it's transformational. So when you're trying to affect change, what does the transformation look like in the listener's life? How will her life be different now? And when you really begin to tell a story and you have someone who's engaged, you want the listener to be vulnerable with you. And that means exploring the obstacles. What's standing in your way of this transformation? What's stopping you? Is it money? Is it your boss? Is it time? Is it doesn't align with our strategy? Is it we can't get other people on board? When you can get your listener to tell you, I'd really love to do this, but I don't know how. Here's what's stopping me. You have an opportunity now to fix this together, to move into that future together, hand in hand. And so the last piece of telling this story is to figure out what the win-win is for both of you. And it sounds a little disingenuous if you're trying to sell a product or service. You're like, well, when you win, I win. It sounds like a cliche. But frankly, everyone knows you're there to sell something. The question is, when you win, what happens? Because oftentimes the customer doesn't understand what the winning is outside of you taking money out of their wallet. So the win is, I'm so excited to bring you on board as a customer because we intend to learn from you. In fact, I'd like to invite you to my customer advisory board so that you can be in our ear as we create our product roadmap and constantly make this better. I'd love to put you in touch with other customers who are using it, who can help you figure out the shortcuts, because when more people use our software inside the company, all the better. I want to show you the ways to make this work for both of us, because I know if you love it, you'll refer me to 4 other friends. And that's what I'm looking for. So oddly, when we're selling innovation, we need to talk about how we both win in order for the deal to really close. And that's important. It seems counterintuitive, but that level of vulnerability, and frankly, this is your opportunity to be vulnerable. We don't necessarily know what's next 3 years from now, but I can assure you, we won't go it alone. We'll be talking to you the whole time. So these pieces are really important, and these are my how to get it done with these 5 essential rules. So I want to go back to the story about Amy and her new niece. And my fractographers as a whole. Back at Corning, I asked them, what would it finally look like now that I'm done with the protons, neutrons, and electrons? Can you tell me what's actually happening? What is it all for? And the fractographer said, we've developed a new windshield. In fact, your windshield is going to replace your 55-inch television screen. And you can imagine now sitting back in your chair, of your car seat rather, laying back and watching the scenery go by, turning on the last half of Bridget Jones' Diary that you never finished watching, or catching up on emails and connecting via Bluetooth a keyboard while your car drives you home. The windshield is what that proton, neutron, and electron model was all about. And they were so excited to talk about how your car was going to become your entertainment center of the future. And so sometimes we get so lost in the minutia of what we're trying to communicate, we forget the really big picture. And so I just want to leave you thinking about that picture you paint of the future. How is it making that horrible commute in LA home just a little bit better? How do I come home to my family relaxed and rested rather than stressed and frustrated? And what will it be like for that person when they begin to explain what their ride home was like to their friends and family? So they go out and get the next, in this case, Tesla, that will have this beautiful windshield installed one day. So thank you so much, everyone. And I would love to take questions from the group and I hope this has been helpful to all of you.
Susan, can you reshare the number to text for the story material?
Sure.
And I'll be sure to include that in the follow-up email that goes to everyone.
There we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Susan, thanks so much for this presentation, because it was so, it was such a beautiful story that you told to help us think about how to tell beautiful stories. The thing that hit me and some of the things you were talking about was was the notion right out of the box where you talked about your story, you want your story to have impact. And if your role or job is to create change, and I would argue there's not a soul on this call that isn't involved in that, whether it's part of their day job or it's how they're helping other women, which is what one of the common grounds this group has, or whether you're thinking about what you're doing in your community or your family, can get super personal. What I loved about it was the journey, the notion of journey that you're trying to take people on in order to engage them in what you think ultimately is helpful to them. So it's such a beautiful story. I once attended a session where there was a woman who was trying to explain to people how to raise money, and particularly for nonprofits, because everybody feels weird about asking for money. Asking for money is always such a hard job, in general. And one of the things she had turned on her head, and you described in a very different way, but same sort of similar notion, was this notion of like, how do you make the listener feel like it's such an opportunity? This is your moment. It's an incredible gift that you're being given, to show up and participate in a new way, however that looks. So I thought I really loved some of the things you shared with us around all of that. It's very thought-provoking in terms of how I think about, even for myself, how do I think about getting people excited about things that I think matter, so loved it. Thank you for that.
I'm so glad. Yeah, it's really helpful to think about the end in mind. We all know that phrase from Maya Angelou, that people don't remember what you said or what you did, they remember how you made them feel.
Right.
And it's true, because those are genuine neurotransmitters that stay in the body. Right. So we actually feel it. And when we use expressions like, getting the message right is hard, but when we say things like, I want to wash that man right out of my hair, we can physically see it. And so one of the, core tenets of great storytelling is actually invoking the five senses, because we register it in the body, we can feel it. And so when you talk about the smell of warm chocolate chip cookies, or I could feel his hand on the small of my back as he was guiding me into the ballroom for the first time, or, all of those things, we immediately connect and our body responds in a very intuitive way. So, when you're thinking about telling the story, it's where are the feelings? What are those emotions that I need to trigger in order to move people to action? And then what will I leave them with as they're exiting? And that's why also that win-win is so powerful, because there's a great sense of satisfaction when we know that we're doing this caregiving, that we're being empathetic listeners, we're helping to solve the obstacles, and we're both walking away better than when we walked into the room. So all of those feelings are so important because they stay here. And that enables people to share the story when we leave them feeling something. And by the way, if we leave them feeling horrible, they're more likely to share the story.
Right.
So just a reminder of that, right? When we leave, because we certainly can share the plot of a horror movie quite easily. And when we hear a terrible story on the news, right, we know that lies disseminate faster than truth. We know that negative emotions are actually far more triggering and far more resonant in the body. So just a reminder, and I don't have a value judgment about the energies you'll choose to leave people with, but you can think about what's incredibly powerful when you're trying to affect change.
It's like Patricia has her hand up with a question.
Oh, yes, please.
Hi, Susan. I could not have loved this anymore. So thank you. I bet you I'm speaking on behalf of everyone here. Thank you so much. I'm on a mission to help educate families about how to prepare for the high cost of higher education so that the children that they love can pursue their academic and career dreams without the crushing weight of educational debt. And I'm also on a mission to encourage employers to offer education savings benefits.
Mm.
I think for years, those who've worked in this field have scared the daylights out of people with just how much college is going to cost. So I tried to help individuals first envision what experience they want when their children come of age and how that they want it to look and feel. And I also share my own personal experience of having this guy in my life graduate debt-free just last year and what I did to attain that. And I find people relate very much to a personal story of someone who paid back $100,000 in their own debt and then determined to save a little bit at a time so that the next generation didn't have to do the same. So I wanted to get your thoughts on getting your audience to envision for themselves, certainly sprinkling for them what that future can look like, but then like really asking them in their own mind to visualize what they want it to look and feel like. Is that a strategy? It seems to be working well for me, but I didn't know what you thought about,
Yes.
encouraging them to think it through too.
Yeah, I love this. I love the sensation that you're leaving people with of like, this is doable, this is possible. And showing your own personal story is absolutely phenomenal. I know my son is graduating on Friday. So I'll be, I wouldn't say lucky. I guess I didn't take the appropriate steps necessarily to figure out that debt connection, but I certainly would have liked that. But so yes, painting that picture of what it could look like. And then I also just want to share with you some of the barriers to, this futuristic or this innovation storytelling way of thinking, because it's not as straightforward as you might think. It's kind of like storytelling, the 501 seminar level, I think of it as, because you're really asking people to change their behavior, which is a very hard thing to do. And so part of the ways linguistically that we do that is thinking about ways to introduce innovation in a way that we haven't before. And we do that incrementally. So while the shift may be great, so you might say, you used to put your money in this kind of account, you'll now need to put it in that kind of account. And frankly, you should be thinking about this level of risk or that, right? There could be some complicated financial instruments that you're asking people to do, not just shift their behavior. The way that we introduce innovation is actually quite ancient. Like the fact that we call it email is like, when's the last time you were excited to go to your mailbox? And frankly, I don't think my kids have ever seen an inbox that actually lived on a desk where an assistant would put papers into, and then there would be an outbox where she would collect them from when you were done. In fact, I was cleaning out my house. We were moving in 2020, and I picked up a floppy disk and I said, "Oh my gosh, Michael, look what I found. My thesis is saved on here from college." And he just looked at me like I had three heads and said, why would you 3D print the save icon from Microsoft Word? I said, come again? He said, why did you 3D print the save icon from Microsoft Word? And I was like, you're right. That's what your 50-year-old mother is doing. She's 3D printing save icons because he had no experience of the save button as being a floppy disk that we actually save things on. There was no connection any longer between what we know to be save, because we know that's a floppy disk, versus. So we actually, when we're taking people, sometimes we use ancient wording, ancient imagery to guide people from the old to the new. And we need to do that in order to move them along, because the human body rejects change, period. So just even saying the word change in a meeting releases stress hormones, cortisol levels. So when we can reduce stress by going, see, it's just like putting it in an inbox. See, it's just like mail, as opposed to transatlantic underwater, electronic communication. That's terrifying. Email, that's okay. iPhone. I think phone calls are the least amount of time I spent on this device, actually making a call. I use it least as a phone, as opposed to everything else that it does. So what I want to say to you is, as you're thinking about taking people through a shift, and this is for all of us, especially when it comes to new technologies, is how do I use old words to describe new things to lower the stress level among people who have to make a change? It feels like a tiny little step.
Thank you.
That was a super long answer, Patricia, and I'm sorry.
Got it. I totally took it in. Thank you so much.
But these are the devices we
Susan.
use as communicators to kind of take people one step at a time into really big disruption and really big transformation.
Susan, it's Claire here from London. Now, I'm on a busy high street because that's the nature of the day. But I have a question. How do you deal with skeptical reception of what you're talking about? We're all women, we're into the emotional aspect of storytelling, and we absolutely understand about the human side of it. But I meet with so many people who say, oh, don't be ridiculous, that's far too soft, it's far too soppy. And I wondered how you dealt with that sort of thing.
I love the skeptics. They're my favorite because they're my biggest converts, frankly. And what I find is that immediately as you start telling a story, your human biology takes over. You're just enraptured with a great story. It is, you really have no defenses. I work with companies like GE and Corning and Citibank, and those guys and those women are just give it to me straight. I only want the top line. I don't need a lot of fluff. I don't want to hear it. And then they find themselves repeating themselves endlessly. And those leaders who tell stories, it's not about coming in with this full-throated emotion like it's a Harlequin romance, right? It's about evoking the emotion necessary in order to create change. So my story could be 4 sentences, and it really would be impactful and effective. I just have to be really thoughtful about how I bring that in. So if I'm saying we're going to have, 4,500 layoffs, we're going to be, shutting down XYZ center, I had better come with a great story in order to tell some very difficult truths to people. And I had better be thoughtful about what the future is going to look like on the other side. Otherwise, I'm not going on that journey with you. So I would say to the skeptics is you can't fight human biology. Number one, I'm not telling a story for story's sake. I'm telling it because it's the most productive way to conduct a meeting, a town hall, an email discussion. And it doesn't have to be fruity and frivolous and endless. In fact, a great story sounds like this. Everything was the same. We were living in status quo. Then something changed, something shifted. There was a boom, a shift, right? That's the shift that we talked about. And on the other side, nothing will ever be the same again. And I'll tell you what the consequences of that shift are. So you could do this in 3 steps. You could do it with, here was the status quo, there was a giant shift, and let me share with you now the consequences. If you want add a layer to that, what is now the moral of the story that I want to leave people with? What's the theme? The consequences that we experience will now lead us into X, and that should be sufficient. So if you want to do the shorthand of it, it's 3 steps with a theme, and you could tell a story short. And I have yet to find an executive who doesn't have the tolerance for that. And I know we're running over time. I just wanted to.
Thank you so much. That was really fabulous. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And you could do it. You could do the Joseph Campbell way, and you could have 9 steps. You could take a look at Luke Skywalker, and you could go through the Star Wars metaphor, and those are 7 steps. I think 5 will do you just fine.
Mm-hmm. Susan, thank you so much. There was such rich information in this presentation. And I know I'm speaking on behalf of everyone because I don't know if you were able to see any of the notes in the chat, but that was the consistent message coming through for you, just so you know, is how much people learned and felt like they're taking away. So we can't thank you enough for spending this time with us and imparting such important information to help us think about how we can be more impactful in everything we do. So what an amazing outcome. So I think if we were there, Susan, we'd give you this huge round of applause of thank you.
That's good.
We're doing it virtually. I hope you know that. Thank you for being willing to share some of this content with everybody, because I know that'll be important to the group. And I I think we always end on an action at Quorum, and I think the action is how do we take all these amazing things we learned today and put it into action, to further the things we're all working on. So I think that's just such an amazing gift you've given us. So I'd like to call that out as our action. And Susan, if by chance you're free, the big event that Quorum's doing starts on the 20th of May. It's a retreat up in Narrowsburg, New York for two and a half days. And anyone that's on the phone that still might find that their schedule's changed and want to join us, we would love to have you. It's the first time we're going to get together physically, really, as a group. So we're pretty excited about it. And so I just wanted to call that out for everyone to keep that in mind. And I think that's a wrap for us today. So thank you again, Susan, for being so gracious and helpful. And we look forward to having you back. That was so great. I think we need like an encore. Doesn't everyone agree? Yeah.